appreciate Ed and his prayers of the people this week. I appreciate him lifting up a lot of really hard and complicated things in our world right now. Wednesday, I was here at a meeting when the news started to come in about the violence that had happened in Minneapolis. Like many of you, I felt a lot of really big emotions right away. I did some research, I did some looking, I saw some things you can't unsee, and that stirred up some big emotions. Thursday, Bob and I got away for a few days and got to use our pastor appreciation gift from this congregation, and we were gone Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, and it was much needed, and it was good timing, and I'm grateful for that. Thank you so much. It gave me a lot of time to process some of those big emotions that I had felt stirred up inside myself. It also gave me some time to think about how do we connect the headlines that we're seeing and the context in which we're living with this conversation that we're going to have the next 3 weeks around forgiveness. And I realized that there's some things we need to do first before we just jump right into this conversation. First and foremost, I want to ask you to join me in a moment. And this isn't just a moment of silence for Renee Good and the loss of her life. That is valid and huge and horrible. But I also believe we congregationally need to take just a moment to acknowledge the emotions and the feelings that we have in ourselves that have been stirred up by headlines, by videos, by statements, by Facebook comments. We get really dysregulated and we carry that and we carry it into spaces. But I also want to take a moment to just quietly center how hard it is and how critical it is that we continue as a people to wrestle for what is good and what is right, and to follow the commands of Jesus is not always good and right. It doesn't always feel that. When Jesus calls us to welcome the stranger and to care for the most vulnerable, that places us in places of tension with this world. And that too needs to be named and centered. So I just invite you, will you join me for a couple deep breaths? The second thing that I need to do before we start this conversation is I need to provide some clarification and some differentiation on what this conversation is and what this conversation is not. So this conversation around forgiveness, it was a conversation that began over coffee. Shane Moore, who's the pastor over at Wesley United Methodist Church, and we meet and have coffee once a month together. We talk about all kinds of things. We talk about our own lives, how difficult it is to be in ministry, the world around us today, big theological concepts. And many, many months ago, we started talking about, wouldn't it be neat if we could put together a sermon series where we could collaborate together? And we started talking about how could we do that? What could that look like? What would the topic be? And as we continued to process this idea, the topic that kept coming to both of us that is hard to preach about, is hard to listen to, is hard to wrestle with, but is so critical for us as followers of Jesus, for us as people, but also it is critical in the time and the space that we are living right now, is this conversation around forgiveness. So we created this idea, this format, that this week, you and I are talking here, and Shane and his faith community are talking about a foundation of forgiveness, kind of a theology of forgiveness. Next week, I'm going to get up extra early, and I'm going to go over to Wesley, and then Shane's going to come over here, and together at both churches, we're going to have a conversation using some of the teachings of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on forgiveness as we honor MLK Sunday, talking about how do we apply that to our lives and to our walks. And then the last week in January, Shane and I are actually going to switch spots. He's going to come here and talk with you all, and I'm going to go to Wesley, and we're going to talk about the hardest person to forgive, which is often ourselves. So as we look at this and we enter into these 3 weeks talking about a topic that's difficult, I need to give you my definition of forgiveness. You're not going to find this in the dictionary. This is totally Christy. I would love to put out my own dictionary sometime because I think I tend to look at words a little differently than some people do. But here's how I would define forgiveness. And this is what I spent a lot of time the last few days as we were in the quiet thinking about. I thought a lot about how I would define forgiveness as a personal act between individuals who have been connected by community, relationship, or circumstances. Would you guys maybe agree with that? It's a personal act between two people who've had some kind of connection, right? Here's what forgiveness is not. Forgiveness is not something between me and a system. It is not between me and an overarching hierarchy. And sometimes I think we need to make sure we make that differentiation. That's something different. That's something more like justice that we're going to talk about later this year. So I want to acknowledge as we start this that I know that we are navigating through troubling times in our world and in our nation. And I know that many of the systemic struggles that we see happening right now have either caused relationship issues for some of us, maybe deepened relationship issues for some of us. And it's important to know the difference between the relationships that have been impacted and the system of oppression or injustice. And I think we need to make that differentiation before we start. The other thing that I need to do is to offer a trigger warning. I do a lot of work around religious trauma. That's one of my big areas of interest and passion because of my personal experience. And places where I have seen sacred spaces weaponize language and concepts and use them in a way that they were not intended. And forgiveness may be one of the most triggering places I see that happen a lot. I talk about something called toxic forgiveness. And here's what I mean. If you have ever been in a situation where there has been pressure applied to you to extend forgiveness to someone to reflect the depth of your faith, and doesn't give you the time to process that forgiveness or what that looks like or what that means for you or give you that personal journey to that place to sincerely extend forgiveness, there's something really harmful in that. And if that has ever been an experience for any of you, I see that a lot of times with abuse victims. I see that a lot of times in victims of assault. It's really important for you to recognize that the depth of your faith is not defined by the width of how far you're willing to forgive. That is a personal journey and process, and each of us are different. We can't apply the same yardstick and the same timetable to everyone. I've been the recipient of that language, and it's hard and it's messy. So my hope is that if that's you and you've experienced that in some way, that these next 3 weeks help to reframe some of that for you. Maybe it gives you some different language. And if that is you, and these conversations are hard and they're triggering in some way, I want to give you a couple of tools to care for yourself in the midst of these conversations. So my two favorite in a setting like this, when maybe someone's talking about something that just starts to activate me a little bit, you feel your heart rate go up, you feel yourself become really uncomfortable, one of them is just to take a deep breath. There's something really regulating in our body systems when we take a deep breath. It helps to slow our blood pressure, our heart rate down and drop our blood pressure a little bit. The other one is tapping. You can tap on your wrists, you can tap on your collarbones, but if you start to feel stressed or triggered or activated in this conversation, any of these 3 weeks, I want you to think about those tools and use them as you need. I also want to invite you, if you need to process any of this is what community is all about. For me, church is not just me sitting here Sunday giving you something. What we talk about on Sunday is an invitation to conversation all throughout the week. So if this hits hard for you or steps on toes and you want to grab coffee this week or next week, reach out to me and let me know. I would love to process with you. With all that being said, we're going to dive into this conversation. So when I first got to Yakima, I preached a sermon on what the church is and what the church could be. We talked about prophetic love. And then I entered into a series of sermons called The God of the Gaps. And I introduced this series to you telling you that I had written a book that was my own journey, my own experience of some ways that faith had changed for me over the years. And I published that book in 21, and we went chapter by chapter through that book and through some of those concepts. And it was a way to share my thoughts with you, my experience with you, get to know each other a little bit more. A lot of us had coffee and met individually talking about your own gaps as we tried to kind of get to know each other in that space. But we skipped a chapter, and I skipped a chapter on purpose. And I told you that I was skipping a chapter. Many of you probably won't remember this, but I said we're going to come back to the chapter on forgiveness. We'll come back to having that conversation because I want to do it in a bigger context. It deserves a little bit more than just a one-shot conversation. So to refresh your memories just a little bit, for those of you that maybe weren't here with us when we did that series, I defined the gaps in our life as the in-between places. When we're in between something we need and something we haven't gotten yet. That could be the in-between place of our health. We're between a diagnosis and healing or relief or something. That could be between our finances. We're between a struggle, a debt, a bill, and the ability to pay that. It could be a lot of different things. We have relational gaps. We have cultural gaps. We have a lot of different places that find us in the in-between space. We also talked about in that series how God is personal and individual and not cookie cutter. Not all of our relationships with the divine look exactly the same. They don't sound the same. They don't feel the same. And that's important. We talked about the tension of trust and how sometimes saying that we trust and actually walking out that trust, man, that provides a lot of friction in our day-to-day lives. We talked about the waiting room and the struggle that our human nature does not like to wait. We don't like the uncomfortability of it. We don't like the unknown. We want to hurry up. We want to kind of microwave that mentality and get through something. We talked about our emotions and how I was taught in a lot of spaces, faith spaces growing up, in a very conservative viewpoint that my feelings did not reflect my faith. And they needed to kind of be separated from the two. But I've come to realize that God divinely designed us with the capacity to feel. And that emotions aren't a bad thing. They're a beautiful thing. And they're a way we connect with each other and we connect with God. We talked also about this concept of scorecards and comparisons and how a lot of us, human nature, we have a tendency to constantly compare. But it's really important that we understand that our struggles, our gaps, they don't come with scorecards and we don't earn a grade card. How I go through my struggle may be really different than how you go through your struggle. And they are unique, and it's important that we always remember that. So what I'm going to do this morning is I'm going to share with you some lessons that I learned in my gap. These are lessons from my journey. They may connect with yours. They may not. But I think that there's a piece for all of us to pull into at least one of these. I'm going to share with you 6 quick lessons that I feel like have been really challenging for me, and they continue to be challenging. So hear me. I am not speaking from this perfection pedestal on the topic of forgiveness. Like, I wrestle with this still too. Because we're human, we're going to wrestle for this. So, many years ago, in the midst of a giant gap in my life, I found myself in a service, much like this one, and the text that was being read that day was from Matthew 18, verses 21 and 22, and it said this: Then Peter came to him, Lord, if my brother or sister sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times? Right? Peter thought he was being really generous in that. As many as 7 times? And Jesus said to him, not 7 times, but I tell you, 77 times. Whew. Struggle number 1, lesson number 1. It's okay to wrestle with red letters. It's okay to wrestle with the teachings of Jesus. I understand that the red letters weren't actually there. I'm saying it as a concept. It's okay to wrestle with some of those teachings and to go, ooh, man, that's hard. That doesn't hit easy. That doesn't feel warm and fuzzy. That doesn't feel simple to walk out. I think if we're really honest and we wrestle with a lot of the Beatitudes, there's a lot of those places that, man, that's hard. Those are difficult pieces. And so for me, this was my season of wrestling with this teaching and other teachings we find that Jesus gave on the concept of forgiveness. I was really honest in some of my prayer time and some of my reflection time, and I was able to name very honestly in that relationship, I don't want to forgive. Anybody ever felt that way? Oh, good, I'm not alone. Okay. I didn't want to do it. There's something comfortable about hanging on to a resentment or a frustration or something that we feel really valid in, right? Like there's something righteous that we can claim in that moment. So I did what any good high school national debater did, and I tried to argue my case before God. Anybody ever tried to do that? Anybody ever win? Because I've never won. So I tried to argue and I tried to say, like, this is why this is justified. Like, do you see this? Do you understand how bad this was? Do you see how many people that this hurt? I gave every justification I could, and it was exhausting. For months, I stayed in that space, and I was determined to kind of dig my heels in and prove that my unwillingness to forgive was justified. And here's what I discovered. I found myself in kind of a secondary gap between the call to forgive and my willingness to do so. And man, I hung in that space for some time. And here's what I discovered one day. I remember exactly where I was sitting. I remember exactly what was happening around me. And I remember sitting there and having this thought that said, forgiveness isn't a feeling, Christy. Forgiveness is a choice. And you don't have to choose it. But it's not ever going to be something you feel. Think about that a second. Think about that in your own lives, in your own situations. Forgiveness isn't a feeling. Forgiveness is a choice, a deeply personal, often difficult choice. But it's important that we separate out feeling like we want to forgive and choosing to do so, even if it doesn't make sense or doesn't necessarily feel good at that moment. So, okay, how do I choose forgiveness? Man, that was a long wrestle. I don't know how to choose it. No one's ever really taught me about that. I don't hear those sermons. I don't hear those conversations in faith spaces. How do I choose to forgive? So a friend of mine, one of my good friends and I, we began wrestling with it in different ways because they were dealing with it, I was dealing with it. It gave me someone to process with. And I came across a quote. Keep in mind, I grew up super conservative and evangelical, so one of the things on my bookshelf a lot was C.S. Lewis. And this is a quote that has continued to challenge me, even as my faith has maybe shifted, morphed, changed, and deepened. And the quote said this: to be a follower of Jesus, to be a Christian, means to forgive the inexcusable because God forgave the inexcusable in you. I didn't like that quote. I mean, if I'm really honest, that was a hard quote. But it made me wrestle once again with myself. Like, how many places? I'm not very good at forgiving myself. So week 3 of this series will be fun. But how many places have I made mistakes? Have I messed up? And how grateful am I when that connection with the divine is never turned off? It's never narrowed. It's never disqualified. So I had to wrestle with it again. Am I declaring people out of bounds for myself? For the divine? Is that my job to do? And here's the next thing I had to learn. There is a difference between forgiveness and boundaries. I was never taught the difference. I was taught that if I'm a good believer in Jesus and I follow the commandments to forgive, that just means we have this restoration of relationship. And it feels like nothing's ever changed. But it's really important, and this is something I really, really had. I mean, like, I bear scars on my knees and on my soul and on my heart from this lesson. I had to wrestle with the fact that forgiveness is releasing ourselves from the impact, like the everyday negative emotions that we carry towards people and situations that are heavy, and they saturate everything, and they often impact my relationship with other people who have nothing to do with the situation. but it's not necessarily a restoration of relationship, and it is not putting yourself in a dangerous situation. I was never given that permission, and it's important that we acknowledge that and we name that. So I find myself with this good friend of mine on a beach in Florida. Months later, I'm still wrestling hard with this concept. Anybody ever just sat in nature and been so overwhelmed that you just feel like you're having this holy moment because it's just so beautiful? A few of you? So this was one of those moments for me. It just felt like I could feel holiness around me. It was so beautiful. The sun was starting to set. It was a gorgeous day. The temperature was just right. I walked down. I took my shoes off and I walked down and I picked up a stick. And in the sand where the waves were coming in, where it was wet, I wrote the word forgiveness and I just stared at it. I should tell you I was down in Florida to preach at a church for Mother's Day weekend. And again, I'm wrestling with this, right? Man, you got to get this right in you because you're challenging other people on important things. I was taking this really seriously. So I write the word forgiveness. And I just sat down and I stared at it. And I'm praying and I'm processing and I'm thinking about the choice and I'm thinking about the boundaries that I need to set. And all of a sudden the waves start to come in. And one lap takes away a letter. And a few minutes later, another lap of the ocean takes away another letter. And then another letter disappears. And then suddenly that word is gone. So I got up and I used my stick again. And I wrote the word anger. And I watched a few more minutes as the same thing happened. And then I got really personal and I took my stick and I wrote some people's names in the sand. And I sat there and I watched the same thing happen again and again. And this moment came to me where I realized I had been taught that forgiving was instantaneous. If I say I forgive, I had to mean it wholly, completely in that moment. And so when I started to feel those emotions again, I felt like I didn't do it right. But what I realized as I watched the waves take those letters away one at a time, forgiveness is a process. It happens choice by choice. It happens person by person, relationship by relationship. But I also learned this. I can forgive and I can choose to forgive and I can set boundaries and I can recognize that's going to take some time. But I also have to recognize that I am human. And I can forgive, but I struggle to forget. Amen? Anybody? Things happen and they remind me of oh, but that happened. Oh, but that really hurt. And so what I've had to really learn, and this may be the most important lesson of all, is that I have to remind myself that I chose forgiveness at every remembrance of the hurt. When I get triggered, I have a choice. Do I grab that again and hang on to it and start all over again? Or do I see it? Do I acknowledge it? That stirs up some things in me. I feel the feelings. And that feeling gives me a moment to go, that's an indicator, right? Something's off. Yep, I chose to walk past that. I chose to set a boundary. I chose to do some healing around that. I'm not picking it up again. I'm not going back. I'm not lowering myself back into that space. I have to learn how to forgive at every remembrance of the hurt. And that's hard. That's hard, but that's also holy. Because I think when Jesus tells us to love one another, he doesn't tell us to like one another. Because I think he knows we're going to have tension. We're going to have struggle. But loving one another is the choice to walk these pieces out and to choose to find ways to set boundaries and have healthier relationships where I'm not being harmed all the time. The next thing that I learned is this. I've said it many times, but I'm saying it again. It is a personal process. My journey to forgiveness is unique and individual. It's not going to be exactly like yours. Mine included, I felt the need, because of the kind of situation, the kind of gap I was navigating, I needed to have some closure. That might surprise some of you that I needed to have the last word. But I needed some closure. So I wrote letters, and I looked up addresses, and I mailed letters, and I specifically said, I don't need you to respond to this. I just needed to have some closure and say this. That was part of my process. That's not everybody's process. Everybody's is different. I had a few face-to-face conversations. Those were harder. Letters were easier. But each relationship needed something different. I also found some really important places to set boundaries so that I could protect myself, protect people in my life, and I got some really great mental health support. I have a coffee cup that says, I can love Jesus and have a great therapist. And I believe that with every core of my body. I think that we have to name in spaces like this, especially when we talk about religious trauma, that religion has two bad habits. One of them is often to look down on mental health and tell you that the only thing you need is Jesus. There are a lot of gifted and skilled mental health professionals who know how to help you walk through complicated emotions. And I believe that for many of them, that is a gift that is given by the divine. And I am so grateful for that. But two, I think religion oftentimes tries to reduce really complicated, messy human places like forgiveness into cookie cutter approaches. Like if you ever hear a sermon series that says the 3 steps to forgiveness, get out. Because there aren't 3 steps to forgiveness. Nobody's going to cookie cutter the same way. But we do that all the time. We try to take these big, complicated issues, and instead of acknowledging them and getting down into the mess with each other, we try to systemize them. 13 steps to reconciliation. That's how it's going to be fixed. What we need is relationships, and we need support, and we need a safe place to talk about how that impacts us. Here's the next one. After forgiveness, is it easy? Is it magical? Is it perfect? Nope. Following forgiveness, you still have to wrestle, right? Forgiveness is not an eraser to the past, but I do believe it can be a catalyst to the future. I think of how much energy I spent being angry and resentful and hanging on to my grudges, and I am so grateful I have that energy to invest in other more productive things now. It doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't change it. I've got boundaries in place now, but I can now work on using some of those lessons into the future and helping other people. Because that catalyst for growth, it's for your growth, it's for your well-being, your faith development. It's not always for that particular future relationship. Maybe it's others. I found a quote in this season of my life, and I've had it hanging almost anywhere I've ever lived or worked, and it says this: always take the high road because it's always less crowded. That's what forgiveness means to me, right? I have to choose to take a higher road. I have to choose to set some boundaries. I have to choose to keep taking that higher road, even when I feel tempted to maybe take a shortcut onto some other emotions that I might feel. But those pieces and those places, that is where I have discovered some of these lessons about who God is to me today, how I connect with the divine and the holy today, that I don't know that I would have learned had I not chosen to fight with forgiveness and wrestle and debate and question. And it makes me grateful that I follow a system and a teaching and I ascribe to a thought process of a holy one that allows me to question and wrestle and debate. And I'm grateful for that. I am far from perfect. I am far from perfect. But I will always do my best from this space to speak authentically and relatably. And my hope is that it connects with someone who maybe you're struggling with similar things. And maybe you need to know that there's an empathetic ear that is happy to listen and that you don't have to struggle alone. So I said it before, and I'll say it again. As we go through this series the next 3 weeks, if you want to talk, if you want to process, I will always make space in my calendar for us to do that. I can help myself listen, but if it gets above my pay grade, I know a lot of really great professionals in this area, and I'm happy to help make those connections as well. I want to invite you to join me. Grab your hymnals. We're going to sing the song, Help Us to Accept Each Other. I'm not going to lie, it was kind of hard to pick a response song after this message. There aren't a lot of great hymns about forgiveness when it comes to each other, but this one, I think, helps us to get started a little bit. Help us to accept each other. None of us are perfect. None of us are going to get it right. But what does it look like for us to practice acceptance and love and to choose forgiveness where we need to? Will you join me in this song?